Up front, I'm going to lay out for you kind of my position on Scripture, because this affects, obviously, how I see this entire issue. My position as a priest in the Episcopal Church, and priests in the Episcopal Church differ on their position in Scripture, is that Scripture is the humanly authored, divinely inspired story of the relationship between God and humanity. And the question of inspiration is where you get into a lot of questions, because people have used this word throughout Christian history to mean different things. Anything from an angel almost whispered it into the ear of the evangelist to it has, it's somebody who's religious, so they're writing within inspiration. I have a pretty high view of inspiration. I don't believe it's whispered by an angel, but I believe there's quite a bit of dialogue between the authors of the Bible and the divine at any given time in the writing. It contains everything necessary to salvation. This is the vow I had to make as an Episcopal priest when I was ordained. That's a very minimalist statement. It's saying that we know that within the Bible is the way to salvation. It doesn't say that it contains everything necessary to science, or everything necessary to sociology, or everything necessary to English, or everything necessary to everything else. It says we know it contains what's necessary to salvation because that's what we're about in the church. It's the primary source of authority for the church. There's no question. Scripture comes first. But it also shares authority. In Anglicanism, we talk about a three-legged stool. Authority comes from three sources: Scripture, tradition, and reason. Scripture has to be interpreted. You get into some passages in the Bible and you literally will have no idea what they're talking about. So what does it mean? Well, the way you figure it out is the tradition, the way that people have interpreted through the centuries. Well, what have other people said? Everybody from an evangelical who's written this source to St. Jerome back in the 3rd century. What does church tradition, how have people interpreted this in the past? And reason. God has given us an ability to reason, beyond that of anything else in the animal kingdom. If God has given that to us, then surely God must expect us to use it in relationship with God. I say as a humanly authored document, it contains different, sometimes conflicting views. It also contains what we might call, in a modern view, fiction. Now, I almost hesitate to use that word because moderns are used to walking into a bookstore and seeing a fiction and a non-fiction section. If you were to walk into a medieval scriptorum, there wouldn't be a division between the two. They would be seen as equally important. Basically what I'm saying here is there are parts of the Bible that are, for instance, the parables of Jesus. Jesus says, there was a man walking on the road. He doesn't mean that there actually was a man walking on the road. He's using the by then established Jewish tradition of Midrash to make a statement about something. He's making up a story and teaching something with that. You also have things, for instance, in the Psalms, the mountains clap their hands. Obviously, the mountains don't actually clap their hands. We're talking about a metaphor here. So there are metaphors, allegories, similes in the Bible, which sometimes gets us into trouble with people in the secular world who are saying, well, that's fictional, so it doesn't have value. You've got fiction and nonfiction. Nonfiction is truth, fiction is unfactual. I also believe that as a humanly authored document, it does contain glosses and other errors. We can go back through different versions of the Greek text, and we can tell that 3 different Greek texts use a different word here. Which one do you choose? Somebody down the line has to make a choice. And often one of the reasons why you'll find difference in English translations is people will say, no, I don't think the authors, the people who put together this Greek text chose the right one. I'd rather that they had used this, so I'll translate it this way. So there are things that have gotten into the text through, you've got to remember, for most of Christian history, up until the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, if you wanted a Bible, you had to have a monk copy it for you. And when that happens, occasionally things get into the text. And we actually believe we have better Greek and Hebrew texts now than we ever had in Christian history, because we've got all these different ones we can compare and do word studies on. Okay. So what I'm saying up front is there are contradictions in the Bible. If somebody says there are contradictions in the Bible, I say yes. So For instance, one is, how did Judas die? Matthew tells us that throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But if we read in the book of Acts, he acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. Now, I suppose if somebody was really inventive, they could say, well, he bought the field, and then he went out to the field and hanged himself, and after he hanged himself, he fell headlong, and his bowels gushed out. But I don't think that's really doing justice to the text. What you have here, the Acts is written by the same author as Luke. You have two different traditions of people believing what happened to Judas. And if you look back in the history of Hebrew interpretation, for instance, if you look in Hebrew interpretation in the Talmud, if there are two opinions, they keep them both. They say, well, this is the majority opinion, so this is listed first. This is the minority opinion, so this is listed second. And that's exactly what I think happens in the Christian Bible, is these people are come up through the Jewish ideas of textual interpretation. So when they have two competing stories, they keep them both. Why not? Why can't you have two stories that just don't have the facts similar? The obsession that we have to have one story with all the facts set down is a modern obsession, something that was not a problem, a large problem before the Enlightenment. Second one, Paul's conversion experience. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Or, just a few verses later, now those who were with me saw the light but did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I think you've got, this is an account from the narrator, and this is an account from Paul. But evidently somewhere when Luke was writing this, he knew of these two different stories, and he decided, instead of taking upon himself the role of a person who could decide such weighty matters, he decided he'd just include them both and let people deal with that, and deal with that contradiction. 4 Gospels. We have 4 Gospels in the New Testament. Each one of them from a different type of community with different chronologies. If you read through these different accounts, Jesus does things in different order. And you'll see people going through incredible machinations trying to get them all to fit into a single timeline. But that's not what the early church thought. There was a guy, this is what was called the Diatessaron in 175 by the church father Tatian. He said, there's 4 different accounts. I'm going to combine them into one. So he took all 4 accounts and he made what you would read it as a gospel harmony today is the term for this. He made the first one in 175 CE. It never caught on. Nobody was interested. Everybody said, we prefer to have the 4 different voices of Scripture. And if, this is really well put out if you look at the Book of Kells, which is an Irish book of Gospels. The Irish actually represented each Gospel as a different person. You have the eagle and the man and the ox and the I can't remember the 4th one. But you have 4 different animals. I mean, the Celtic Christians thought this was really important, that you have 4 different voices, sometimes contradictory, but generally going in the same direction. But they didn't feel they had to iron out all the little differences between the different